Okay, welcome everybody. People are filtering into the room here at just a little bit 12:15 in Chestnut Hill and 5:15. And we'll be here with Tom Tugendhat, Member of Parliament. But before we begin the discussion, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Abbott. Peter recently came to Boston as a Consul General from the United Kingdom to New England. Before coming to us in Boston, he served in Islamabad. Prior to that, he was in Lisbon, and he also served in Washington, D.C. He's had a briefing as well in counterterrorism and countering extremism, working with the UK Home Office and the Foreign Commonwealth Office. He also has deep American connections, and I'll let Peter talk a little bit about that, but he worked for Dennis Hastert for a spell, as well as Arianna Huffington. Peter's also an academic. He's a PhD from Cambridge in Greek tragedy. So what else would you do but serve the British Foreign Office? Peter, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to say a few words, and thank you for your help in arranging this session with Tom.
Great, Bob. Well, thank you very much for the very generous introduction. It's great to be here virtually at Boston College again, which has for many years been such a good friend of the consulate here in Boston. Over the last 4 years, I've found myself explaining to diplomatic contacts on countless occasions, well, this is it, this is the defining moment for the UK's relationship with Europe, whether that's been a European Council meeting, the passing of a deadline, or a vote in the British Parliament. It's felt like the last 4 years have been replete with these kind of key, these key landmarks. I think this week we find ourselves at perhaps and probably the last of these landmarks, the question of whether at the 11th hour the UK and the EU can agree a free trade agreement, which makes this a perfect week to hear from our guest today, who is well placed to talk not just about the UK's relationship with the EU, but also with Ireland, which is a particular resonance here in Boston, and particularly at Boston College, and with the United States, as we anticipate a new administration in Washington starting in January. Tom Tugendhat is the Conservative Member of Parliament for the constituency of Tunbridge and Malling in the southeast of England, and Chairman since 2017 of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. Under his chairmanship of the committee, they've focused on the UK's relationship with China, India, Russia, and of course the UK's foreign policy after Brexit. I should also say the Foreign Affairs Committee is charged with scrutinising the Foreign Office, my employer, which recently merged with the Department for International Development to form the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to pass over the floor now to Mr. Tugendhat and to say, Tom, welcome to Boston.
Look, thank you very much. The last time I was in Boston, I was covered in lobsters and butter, and trying to get as much of your main island lobster down me as possible on, I think it was Pier 49, 61. I can't remember what number it is now, but on the harbour and enjoying all the joys of New England. And it's a great sadness to me that I'm not with you physically. Boston College has an extraordinary history and reputation well earned over literally centuries. So I hope very much that you'll invite me to come in person someday. But look, this has been an extraordinary few years for the UK and indeed for our closest ally in the United States. And what we're seeing at the moment is really fascinating, I think, for those of us who observe foreign policy, but I think challenging as well for those of us who are trying to make it. Because what we're seeing a change in the world. Now, we've obviously, because it's who we are, we've focused on our own interests. Here in the United Kingdom, we focused on where our government is going and what our relationship to the European Union is like. And in the United States, very understandably, you've focused on the change into and then now out of the Trump administration. But actually, this isn't just about us. This is actually about global movements of which we are a part, but of which we are not the whole. If you look at the rise of nationalism, you could easily talk about Trump and Brexit, of course, but you could just as easily talk about things like Putin or India's Modi, or you could indeed talk about Erdogan in Turkey, or perhaps most importantly, you could talk about General Secretary Xi. All of them are showing a greater emphasis on the national and a lowering importance of the multinational. And so I think that we're going through one of those moments where the world is fundamentally changing. And now I know that Peter is really rather more of a scholar than I am, and indeed as an aficionado of Greek tragedy will know that the world can always get worse. You never quite hit bottom. You can always dig through that concrete floor and make sure you get 1 inch closer to hell. But the challenge is not how do we race down, but how do we reach up? And I think there are some real opportunities for us. Indeed, what we're doing today, whereas I'm sitting here in a deep, dark, wintry Kent, and you're sitting, I presume, somewhere in New England, and despite the winter, probably in all the glories of the colours of the fire that hits the leaves of New England in the winter, in the autumn and winter, we're enjoying each other's company. Well, at least I'm enjoying yours. You're probably not feeling quite the same, but we're enjoying each other's company through the joys of technology. But this technology has accelerated globalization, has accelerated rentier states through the ownership of intellectual property and your ability to tax it, and changed the way in which people interact, not just with their own governments, but indeed with the entire world, and of course, most importantly, with their neighbors. So we're going through a profound moment of change in the world, and I think that's making foreign affairs extremely interesting and extremely challenging. So on that note, I will open it up to questions, but I must quickly answer Peter's first question, or first point, which is, this is the end of the Brexit process. Oh no, Peter, not even slightly. The last 3,000 years of English history, Scottish history, Welsh history, and indeed Irish history has been, how do we work together? How do we deal with each other? And how do we deal with those people who are 20 miles, 30 miles off our coast? And do you know what the next 3,000 years is going to be about? Exactly the same thing.
Thanks for that, Tom. And we will definitely welcome you back here to Boston College. Maybe even in the fall, maybe we'll have a football game and we can get some lobster and clam chowder and give you the real New England experience. I am indeed speaking to you from Chestnut Hill, but it's a good question because we could really literally be anywhere. You've been talking about disruption and the UK's relationship with the continent. Let's start there. I think very interestingly, I mean, you're a Tory party politician, but you did not support Brexit. I mean, where do you see this going at this point? What are the main dangers for you? Just last week, in fact, I think you said, if there isn't a deal done, it's a failure of statecraft. And, you know, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that failure will mean, not only for the UK, but maybe for Europe as well.
Sure. Well, look, in fact, much as I'd love to claim credit for those words, they weren't mine. They actually come from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And it's interesting that only a few months ago, he recognized that a failure to get an agreement between Britain and the countries that make up 40, 50% of our trade would be a failure of statecraft. Of course, it's a failure of statecraft. Whose failure? Well, there's plenty of blame to go around for everyone, frankly. It's a failure of the UK, of course, but it's also a failure of the European Union and of different members within it. So the question is, what next, really? Because, as you rightly say, I didn't vote for it, but there's no point in trying to vote on yesterday. You've got to try and shape tomorrow. And I think the decision for those of us who are active participants in politics and who want to make sure that foreign policy works for the British people, and let's not forget, the reason we pay Peter to go to New England is not to eat clam chowder and lobsters, delicious though they are. It's actually to promote the prosperity and happiness of the British people. That's it. We're not interested, frankly, in the prosperity and happiness in the US people or the Canadian people or the French people or any other people. We're interested in the prosperity and happiness of the British people. Of course, that's not achievable unless we have the prosperity and happiness of our friends and allies around the world. And that's where you guys come in. But the prime job, to misquote somebody else who's been quite loud in political circles for the last 4 years, is Britain first, of course. That is literally the job of every government. It's not possible unless you factor in other people, but you have got to prioritize your interests. And now this is where we find ourselves with Europe. We've got to prioritize our interests, but too much of the emphasis can sometimes be on ourselves and not on how our interests are prioritized, because actually our interests are prioritized by having a prosperous and dynamic European Union and European partners who we can trade with, we can travel to, we can interact with on any number of different levels. so that actually our people are extremely happy in going on holiday to France or studying in Germany or buying stuff from Italy or whatever it happens to be, because that is important to us. Now, there's also the reverse is true, which is that for many of us, there is a sadness that the European Union is doing rather too much of what, of course, it has to do, which is to prioritize the prosperity and the happiness of its own people. But in doing so, I think it's being a little bit too narrow, because it should realize, and I hope does realize, that actually the United Kingdom isn't going anywhere. The United Kingdom is an essential partner, not just in trade, but also in culture and in defense and security and so many other areas that promote all of our interests, that we really do need to make these talks work. Now, the challenge for the next few years is not just whether or not the UK economy will grow a little bit more slowly than it would have done had we got a deal. It's actually, how does the European continent work together? And what does this mean for some of those countries that are more challenging for the European Union? I don't just mean the UK, I mean some member states, I mean some non-member states. But finding ways in which this works requires the European Union, as well as us, to be adaptable and to be sensible in the face of political, not just legal challenges.
Tom, a couple of years ago, or maybe it was earlier this year, in fact, I heard you on The Week in Westminster, and you said that perhaps London's most important foreign relation is with Dublin. And in another place I was reading, you were talking about the importance of building relationships with key European partners, Germany, France, and then most essentially Ireland. So, kind of in that context, what does the new British partnership with the UK look like, or with Ireland look like? And, how does Northern Ireland fit into that? That obviously is a big area of concern for us here in Massachusetts.
Sure. Well, look, I'm always struck when people describe US politicians, this has been said of President-elect Biden recently, when they describe US politicians as being pro-Ireland, as though this is a bad thing for the UK. It's not. It's a very good thing for the UK. We want political leaders around the world to be interested in the fate of our islands, and that means being pro-Irish, being pro-British are absolutely fundamental. Anybody who backs the Good Friday Accord, frankly, is a friend of mine. I don't care where they're from. It's important. And it's important not just because it brought peace to the island of Ireland. We know that it did that, but it did much more than that. I mean, many of your students may not know, but when I was going to school in London in the 1980s, the Underground was regularly stopped because there was a bomb on it. And every now and again, a few people were killed. And this happened, I mean, all the time across England, in Manchester, in Reading, in Deal, in Kent, and in London. There were constantly political murders, terrorism, spread by the Irish Republican Army. So, this was something that we saw all the time. So the Good Friday Accord didn't just bring peace to the island of Ireland, it brought peace to the United Kingdom and to the Republic of Ireland, and this was hugely important. Now, I prioritise the relationship with Ireland for the simple reason that it is the single non-discretionary relationship that the UK has. At enormous expense, and I certainly don't recommend this, but at enormous expense and with great difficulty, we could just about cut off relations with every other country in the world. The one country we can't is with Ireland. It's not just because it's the only land border we have, but it's because Ireland and the UK are just much, much closer than I think many people realise. It would be very hard to find an Englishman who doesn't have strong Irish connections. It's pretty difficult. Even somebody who's as English as I am. My great-grandparents, great-grandmother, is from Limerick on the west coast of Ireland. This is absolutely standard for anybody in the UK. The level of cross relationships is huge, and it really means that peace in Ireland, relationships with Ireland, a relationship with TDs and Taoiseachs, over the years is absolutely vital. And that's why when I took over the chairmanship of the Foreign Affairs Committee, our first trip was not, as some others have been, to sort of sunny places with good beaches, but actually it was for a day in Dublin and a night in Cavan on the border, because actually what happens in Cavan matters in Kent.
That's really interesting to hear. I mean, do you feel as though the Northern Ireland Protocol and the agreement reached earlier this week adequately protects the security of the Good Friday Agreement and ensures a good relationship between Britain and Ireland, regardless of the outcome of the Brexit negotiations?
No, and it can't, because the Good Friday Accord was built on the basis of an economic cooperation underpinned by joint membership of the European Union. So there really is nothing that can be added to, on a temporary basis, unless we get an economic relationship that works for both sides. Now, at the moment, we don't have that. It's one of the reasons we need an agreement, and one of the other reasons why, if we don't get an agreement on whenever it is, today, tomorrow, Sunday, I don't know when the last day is going to be, but whenever the last day is, we're simply going to have to come back on the 1st of January and start again, because the idea that we can have a questionable relationship with our closest and most important foreign partner, the Republic of Ireland, and that this could bring instability to our single land border, the Northern Ireland Republic of Ireland border, is simply not acceptable. And it's not acceptable whether you live in Kent, as I do, whether you live in Liverpool, where many people who have relations in Ireland have traditionally landed, or whether it is because you live in Antrim or in Dundalk or indeed in Cavan. So, it's absolutely essential for all of us that we get a really good economic agreement that allows trade to continue. It's also worth remembering, of course, that Ireland, in many ways, is not a split island. It has a single electricity market. It has a single phytosanitary system. It is in many ways a single market of itself.
That's a good point. It's hard to imagine the island itself functioning in distinct kind of ways if you've been back and forth across the border and done any work there. I'm going to point out to the audience that there is a chat function as well as a question and answer function. Please send in questions and we'll try to get them over to Tom. Tom, a question has come in from one of the viewers talking about a New York Times report today that British ports are jammed, and that the Honda production plant is having some supply chain issues in expectation of a Brexit crash out. Is there a danger here, as if an agreement is reached or if an agreement isn't reached, that people are already kind of out in front of that corporations are out in front of that, taking defensive kind of actions, such as the Honda plant? Where are the challenges around this for you, and as this kind of conversation comes to a crunch point?
Sure, but look, most people have been out in front of this by about 2 years. You'd have to be pretty late off the mark to be at the point now. And it's worth thinking about the Honda question in a little bit more of a global context, because actually much of that is to do with the fact that trade in Europe has been very slow this year for rather obvious COVID-related reasons, and that has depressed shipping rates, and therefore many transport vessels have not been as active in our area as they would have been in normal times, and instead shipping has been much more active in Southeast Asia and indeed in the cross-Pacific route. So look, we're seeing, in fact, the sort of, for those of you who've been to London, this is the London bus problem, no buses for ages and then 3 come at once. That's a little bit what's happened to our ports because of the problem with shipping rates, or rather the problem with economic activity, and therefore the consequential knock-on onto shipping supply lines that we've seen now. But look, that's not to say that there aren't challenges. There really are, but the challenges are less likely to come in non-perishable goods like car parts, much more likely to come, if they do come, in terms of things like fresh salad and fresh goods in January. So something that those of us in Kent, who are, as you know, not only the Garden of England, but also the gateway to Europe, are especially aware of.
There's obviously been a lot of prep for a no deal in Europe and in Britain. We've heard a lot about the preparations in Kent and the roadside accommodations. What are for you? What are the key things that need to happen now to ensure that there are good relationships, that people are able to continue to move, that goods are able to continue to move? What needs to happen between now and the end of the year to ensure the whole system doesn't seize up?
Well, the fundamental things are we need to get the accords that allow things like haulage permits to work on both sides of the channel, that we get waivers for tariffs and quotas. Otherwise, this can really delay things. And we need the infrastructure investment in the UK to match that of France. I mean, I was speaking to Xavier Bertrand, who is the president of the Hauts-de-France, which is the area, the region of France around Calais and Boulogne and all that area, that really controls the access, if you like. In many ways, it's the access point to the United Kingdom. And the investment that they've made over the last few years is really quite substantial in terms of sort of holding errors and all the rest of it. But he is just as aware as we are that delays on what's called the short straits, that Dover-Calais link, can have a huge implication. I mean, at the moment, you know, it takes quite literally seconds for trucks to be cleared and go through. I can't remember whether it's 20 or 30 seconds, but it's really not very long. If that check goes into any more detail, you're immediately into 2 or 3 minutes at the very shortest. And the moment you do that, you cause delays on both sides of the border, and that means trucks literally parked on the side of the motorway for miles before the borders, and so, you know, before the crossing points. And so people on both sides of the frontier are extremely aware of it. And Xavier Bertrand has been communicating, I know, very clearly with the government in Paris, as just as those of us in Kent have been extremely clear with the government in Westminster, that we really need to make sure that the throughput of traffic is kept going.
Tom, interesting question has come in here, and it's been raised before, and this will help us bridge the distance between Brexit and some other issues. You know, the questioner points out that the trade protections that were stripped from the withdrawal agreement have now been kind of rectified in the changes that have been made to the internal market bill. But this questioner would like to know, you know, has Britain damaged its ability to act as a good faith negotiator by introducing the internal market bill? The question actually reads that this kind of action threaten you know, future potential trade agreements with the United States and with other companies? I think it's a good question in context, especially of, you know, this idea of global Britain and Britain having, you know, more mature or more maturely developed relationships with partners around the world.
I think it's an entirely fair question. And when I spoke about the internal markets bill in the House of Commons, I made the point, which I think, I'm sorry to say, still stands, which is that this was a staggeringly unwise move by Her Majesty's government, because it allowed people to cast us in a rather poor light. But I would put it in the way that some of us may be sadly aware of when we've seen friends of ours get divorced and do things that we think of as particularly vile, but really rather out of character. And we may not be supportive of it, but we do understand that divorce battles are acrimonious and nasty, and we can't judge people by the way they deal with their spouse and the way that they're going to deal with everybody else. And it's certainly true that if you speak to other trading partners that we've dealt with in recent years, whether that be, you know, Canada, we finally did the rollover deal with not very long ago, 2-3 days ago, or Singapore yesterday, and I've been in conversation with both of their governments in recent weeks and months. You know, it's quite clear that you know, they saw it for what it was, which is part of a rather acrimonious negotiation with a long-standing partner, rather than a trend for the future. Now, I'm not saying that's that's not an excuse, that's an explanation. And as I told the Prime Minister to his face, I thought it was a dumb thing to do.
I think a lot of our audience is interested to hear that. You know, Tom, thinking about kind of global Britain, I went back and I read some of the policy position papers and then some of the speeches by the Prime Minister on it. And in 2018, this term seems to have been kind of pushed out into the public sphere. In February, interestingly, earlier this year, the Prime Minister spoke in Greenwich, and he spoke about global Britain, and the speech was mainly about free trade and being able to trade with others around the world. But your committee has been undertaking a very ambitious project to take a look at international policy of UK. Global Britain is part of that. And in a recent policy position paper that you released, you said people really don't know what global Britain means. So, you know, can you tell us a little bit about this process? What are you hoping to achieve out of this? Are you hoping to define what global Britain is, or give it more shape?
So we can't bluntly do that. What we're trying to do is challenge the government to do it, because, you know, I know that you in the United States are used to having staffs of thousands in your political bodies, and, you know, I was speaking to my opposite number in the US Senate, who was saying that you know, they normally have an away day for his 50 staff. I have 4 staff. And those 4 staff work on constituency matters. Everything to do with the Foreign Affairs Committee is done by me and done by 4 staff in Parliament. That's it. You know, it's a much smaller operation. So we're not, you know, we don't run a large number of civil servants. We don't have party employees. We don't have any of the trappings of a committee that the United States House or Senate has. So it's worth putting that into context. And we produce. So I write the reports myself. They're not staffed through in the way that the US system are. And that you know, that naturally means that it's much harder to come up with alternatives in the same way that the government is able to do. So what we do is we put up questions and we challenge the government to answer them. And in this one, look, I think the question on what is global Britain is absolutely fundamental. It's a slogan that the Prime Minister has used when he was Foreign Secretary that still doesn't yet mean anything, but yet it hints to something that I think that we understand. We understand it means Britain no longer entirely part of Europe. It means Britain somehow in the Indo-Pacific. It means somehow Britain in Australia and South America. It means quite a lot of things that are very hard to nail down. And until we do nail them down, are a bit too vague to be put into practice. So what we're trying to get the Foreign Office to do, and Peter's part of this process, I have no doubt at all, is to say, what does it mean? Does it mean supporting colleges like yours? Does it mean opening up to free trade, or are we looking for free movement? What is it exactly we're challenging for?
What are you hoping to develop, or what are you hoping that the government takes away from it? I mean, I read some of the testimony that was delivered. You've had very eminent people, including Samantha Powers, gave some remarkable testimony.
Exceptional, absolutely exceptional.
It was really interesting reading, and you have to dig a little bit in the website in order to get to the raw material, but it's there, and it's quite interesting. And there's a lot of exchange between yourself and Samantha Power about multilateral organizations and the importance of the veto in these. I mean, what are the things you want the government to do policy-wise, you know, from your findings?
So my view, and this is you know, this is personal rather than committee view. My view is that the United Kingdom does actually have a role in the world, and if we're going to exercise influence in the coming years, then it's by recognizing what our strengths are and not pretending that they are other than they are. You know, we're not going to be sending gunboats to foreign ports anymore in the way that we did 200-300 years ago, and we're certainly not going to be you know, running the entire world's trading system as we did, you know, over a century ago. Instead, what we're going to be doing, if we are going to be successful, is to leverage the skills that we really do have, which is, if you like, the bureaucracy of power, by, you know, supplying the fantastic civil servants. Peter is but one example, but the fantastic civil servants who enable any number of different international organizations, from the UN right the way through to many of the NATO operations, and indeed many of the temporary multilateral organizations that are set up to enable cooperation. And we're going to leverage all of that and effectively become, I think, an enabling power. You know, already in the last few years, we've noticed that there are, in reality, only 2 global hegemons, and they are the United States and China, and both of them have challenges to the international order. You know, the last 4 years of the United States power has put in question, for some people, the United States commitment both to NATO and the UN and other forms of multilateralism. Certainly the withdrawal from the World Health Organization during a global pandemic has been surprising. And China's breaches of international protocols and international norms has also been challenging the international order. So I think countries like the United Kingdom have a very important role, if you like, as sort of second-tier powers, though perhaps that's not the polite way of putting it. But those countries, Japan, us, Germany, Australia, many others, who are fundamentally dependent on the international rules-based system and really need to invest in making it work. And so I think the UK can be a coordinator, can be an enabler for those things. I don't think, you know, I don't think we need to find ourselves in the US position or the Chinese position of attempting to lead these organizations, but certainly enabling them so that the defense of the international order is done by many, many, many smaller countries, which I think, as we know from the internet and many other things, a distributed network of power is often more stable and more secure than a polar network. And so I hope that that is where the UK can go.
What do you expect the future of the U.S.-UK relationship to look like as you become an enabler, but also as the Biden administration begins to bed down? Biden administration, I mean, has laid out some very clear, I think, priorities, especially around climate change, with the appointment of Secretary Kerry to a new board level, a cabinet level position on climate, or a re-engagement with the World Health Organization, an engagement on a vaccine distribution program for less wealthy nations. As the Trump administration leaves and the Biden administration kind of beds in, I mean, what's your relationship going to be like with your counterparts in the United States, and what do you hope the U.S. and the UK can do together in the future?
Well, look, I have to say I'm personally particularly pleased with many of the appointments that the Biden administration has made. Many of them I've known for many years. Some of them I worked with in Afghanistan in the 2000s, or when I was military assistant to the chief of the defense staff of the United Kingdom in the early 2010 to 2013. These are really good people, and there are many fantastic names. You mentioned one there, but I mean, I think Tony Blinken is an outstanding choice for Secretary of State, and I think Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor is a fantastic appointment. I mean, really, really good appointment. So there are some great people there, and I think actually there's an awful lot of overlap between what the Biden administration is trying to achieve and what the UK government is trying to achieve, or certainly what the British people are trying to achieve. We do want to work on helping China to grow within a stable rules-based order rather than by breaking the system around it. Now, that does mean helping China to channel its power rather than just to challenge power around the world. So what does that mean? It means working on things like environmental diplomacy, I think things like carbon pricing to help both onshoring jobs and also to help promote some of the environmental policies we know we need in order to reverse where we're going at the moment. And I think there's an awful lot to do on that. I also think, by the way, that some of the US leadership that we see in other ways is really inspiring. I don't know how many of you have noticed, but the head of the World Food Programme, former governor of South Carolina, David Beasley, has just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, this is US leadership in a multinational context that I think is frankly inspiring and really, really impressive. I mean, genuinely world-changing and important. And I think, seeing how the UK can work with people like David Beasley, I know he'll qualify as a UN winner rather than a US winner, but you know what I mean, I think is really important. And, let's see how your new appointment to the UN ambassador works, but I think she's a fantastic leader in her field. And I have to say, General Austin, is a fantastic commander who he didn't know me. I was far too junior, but I knew him in Iraq, and he's again a very impressive appointment. So let's see how this goes.
Just remind the audience, we only have a few minutes left in this session, so if you have a question, please ask it now. Tom, questions come in on the US, UK, Europe, Irish relationship. This questioner references a story from Le Monde talking about how Ireland will essentially become the Europe whisperer for the United States. It was often rumored that the UK played this role. Of course, the United States has many relationships abroad and at different multiple levels. The US and the UK are bound together by NATO and Five Eyes and other aspects. But I mean, how do you see this relationship developing? There are a lot of people and organizations in Ireland who now talk about one of Ireland's competitive advantages is that it's in Europe and it's English speaking. Do you see this as a challenge or a rival to what the UK is doing, or is it a complement to I think the direction that Britain's going?
I mean, I think it complements it, and let's not overstate the benefit of language. I mean, Tony Blinken is a qualified French lawyer who grew up in France and is a fluent French speaker. So I'm not entirely sure that Tony Blinken will see the advantage in speaking English when his French is literally perfect, so, and completely fluent. And there are many other people in the US system who speak, German, Italian, and many other European languages. Not all just for family reasons, but just I don't think Peter speaks ancient Greek for family reasons. I think that was probably a hobby that developed. But I mean, there are many people in the US system who've got fantastic linguistic abilities. That doesn't mean that Ireland doesn't have an important part an important part in this relationship. And it's certainly true that people like President-elect Biden have spent a lot of time getting to know Ireland for personal reasons initially, I'm sure, but for reasons of peace and prosperity as well more recently. And I think that's fantastic because, I mean, as I started off saying, the relationship with Ireland is the single non-discretionary relationship that the UK has. The prosperity of Ireland is therefore fundamentally in the interest of the British people, and the ability of Ireland to influence the actions of one of our most important allies is absolutely key. And so I think that actually having the Irish Republic in the European Union and having Britain in NATO gives the United States both strength in depth and in breadth that is difficult to match in other ways. So it's easy when you look at a relationship like with the 27 European Union countries to see that there's one link or one bridge. There isn't. There'll be many. And the reality is that Britain will have different ins to Germany, for example, than the US will, or to France or whatever. Our closest defense relationship outside the Five Eyes is with France. We actually have British pilots flying French planes. We have British generals commanding French troops. We have, and by the way, and the other way around. I mean, it's an exchange program. In some ways, it's closer than almost any other country in the world. And our closest intelligence partnerships are with, the United States, Five Eyes, of course, with Israel. Next, Germany. Very, very close intelligence partnership. So, these relationships are more complex, they're more varied, and they don't just go through Brussels. So one should be cautious about overstating it.
Excellent. Thanks. Tom, one thing I really want to ask you before we do get off here is about Britain's commitment to overseas aid development. A couple of years ago, the UK showed real leadership by committing 0.7% of GDP to overseas aid development. Chancellor cut that budget this year in the context of the COVID crisis, but went a little bit further in seeking a law change around this, a legal change. What do you think, what do you recommend for the future of the Foreign Commonwealth and the Development Office, actually? And that's another issue as well your committee's been dealing with, is that the combination of these two Whitehall departments into the one.
So look, I think the coordination of aid and diplomacy is an important thing to do. And by the way, the United States does it. The UK was one of only 2 countries that had a split department. So bringing them into alignment brings us into alignment with, Canada and Australia and the United States and France and Germany. So let's not pretend that the UK has suddenly sort of sold out. Actually, we've just come into line with everybody else by bringing them into line. And given, sadly, the nature of global development needs, the idea that we shouldn't align global development needs with those areas where we can also maximize diplomatic influence is absurd. Of course, we should try and align diplomatic influence with development action, because that's where we're going to achieve the best results, and we're going to be able to therefore help the most people, biggest bang for our buck, if you like. And so it's absolutely important that we do that. And that, by the way, means also aligning with friends and allies and making sure that investment works together. But the cut in aid, look, this isn't something that I've got to be honest, it's not something that I'm pleased with. I would like not to see it happen. But I can't argue, in all honesty, that COVID hasn't, done enormous damage to the UK economy. And it's very difficult as well to argue that we should be spending more billions abroad when we so clearly need to be reinforcing our own economy at home. This is not exactly a surprise. It's also worth noting that actually all that the Chancellor did was he took 0.2% off aid and put it on defence. It was just a it was a very simple accounting trick. We're still spending 2.7% on the abroad. It's just instead of it being 2% on defense and 0.7% on aid, it's now 2.2% on defense and 0.5% on aid. But still, that puts us, as one of the highest aid contributors in the world. The United States only spends 0.2%. Now, of course, that's not quite true because other areas of US spending, like, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, don't count in that 0 to 0.2%. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is, amongst other things, the second largest contributor to the World Health Organization, as well as many other organizations around the world. So it's not an entirely fair comparison, but you get the point. The other country that donates a huge amount is Japan, which donates 0.4%. So again, in some ways less than according to GNI calculations, less than the UK, even though the quantum is greater. And this means that actually the only country in the European Union, by the way, that will be giving more in percentage terms than us is Germany. And so it's worth putting in context that although, I wish that we maintained our level of overseas influence, that's hardly surprising. I do chair the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is kind of one of the things I'm interested in. I think it would be unwise to start sort of panicking as though this was sort of the end of the world. It's certainly not. The UK is still one of the most generous nations in the world, donating, I think it's now going to be about £10 billion a year. And although that will change, of course, because the GNI figures will adjust as the COVID crisis hits us, and still maintains the 2% target that NATO asks for, which again puts us in a very, very small camp. So, Britain's overseas commitment as the holders of, the maintainers of most of 2 targets, and having a global diplomatic network and a P5 seat, frankly, the UK still plays a very, very hard international game.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you. And I can't wait to welcome you back or welcome you to Boston College. And as I said, we'll be sure to roll out the lobster and the clam chowder. But I do think our students and the community here would love to hear further from you, especially as we see more, from Brexit and more developments as you discussed in the international affairs. If the audience hasn't had a chance to take a look at Tom's heritage, please do. It's interesting for me to note that you studied at Bristol and you studied for a degree in theology. Of course, if you come here to Boston College, you can study for a degree in theology in one of 2 schools. We have a School of Theology and Ministry where we train professionals, and we have a Department of Theology and Comparative Religion. So you'd be welcome to, I think, and people will be interested to hear from you in both of them. I'd like to just remind the audience that our next webinar is on Tuesday, December 15th, with Connor Murphy, Sinn Féin MLA and Minister for Finance from the Northern Ireland Executive. In the new year, we'll be welcoming Diane Dodds and Helen McEntee, the Minister for Justice from Ireland. There's a few more in the way. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. We're going to keep a close attention on what you have to say and how you're holding the government to account on its foreign obligations.
Thank you.